Tracy Silverman, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. Now, you're known as an electric violinist and you play a real eclectic mix of music from jazz, rock, Brazilian, Indian, through to classical contemporary concertos written by composers such as John Adams and Terry Riley. You started off as a classical violinist training at the Juilliard. Tell me a bit about your experiences of that.
Well, I started out as a classical player and was doing all the, major concertos and stuff like that. And entered Juilliard, with every intention of being, the next great concert soloist, but really kind of got turned off to the competitive nature of what was going on at Juilliard, where you had, a whole floor. The fourth floor was just nothing but practice rooms, rows of practice rooms, and you would see pianists in there literally 10 hours a day, who would just leave briefly to go get some fruit, a sandwich, and bring it back and eat it while they were practicing the left hand and then the right hand, and all listening to each other, playing the same Chopin, ballades, and I just felt that there was something that was really very different from what I loved about music that was going on, in that kind of environment. So, I like to joke that I entered Juilliard hoping to be the next Jascha Heifetz, and I left, hoping to be the next Jimi Hendrix. So it kind of pushed me in a different direction. So, and that was the direction of really pursuing my own music and pursuing music that I thought would be more relevant to the kids that I grew up with and the environment that I live in. And, sort of started this lifelong quest to make string playing and the violin more relevant to our contemporary culture of the 21st century. Of course, it was the 20th century then.
Would you say that moving away from the more competitive classical world, as you saw it, into something more eclectic, lessened the stress you had around performing?
Yeah, and I think the stress of performing in classical music had a lot to do with my changing my career path, because that competitiveness that I was seeing was not just unmusical. It was kind of inhumane, if I can say that, in the sense that it was divorcing me from my, myself, my humanity, my humanness, in that it was, really, forcing me to have to be perfect. It was sort of this Olympics of music, that, he who makes the fewest errors wins the prize. And, I knew it instinctively then, and over the many years have had that corroborated by people like Terry Riley, who I work with a lot, a great composer, very creative guy, who told me recently, he said, well, if you're not making mistakes on stage, you're probably not improvising, because a lot of what we do is improvisation, and because that's just part of the musical process. The creative process involves trial and error, and involves a lot of experimentation. And if you don't give yourself the freedom to experiment and to fall on your face and to do something completely that's a complete fail, you're never going to get, to other achievements. So as a creative artist, as a composer, I knew that, and I knew that you have to give yourself this space to fail all the time, just regularly. That's part of your job, is to create stuff that you're going to toss away, like a writer, and the function of a performer is very different. And it's kind of an interesting subject that, to me, anyway, this separation between the creative side and the kind of recreative side of a performer. And which is blended, very rarely. You see it in jazz, but it used to be much more a part of classical music when improvisation was a bigger part of what classical musicians did. especially like keyboard players, but all musicians did. I figured bass players were reading a number chart. Melody players were intended to know how to change things the second on the repeats, things like that. But classical music became sort of more specialized, like the way the medical field has become more specialized. You have the performers who just play things that people have written, and their job is just to accurately try to recreate, the notes on the page, and then the notes on the page became these holy, scriptures that you can't touch, and I've just decided at some point that wasn't my path. I just felt like I wanted to do something more creative than that, and I would cut myself slack, and I would do things like we would be playing a party, string quartet, Mozart quartet, and I would just mess around with them and improvise with them, and the other players would, at first it was taboo, and then it got fun for everybody. So that was just been my attitude, and I think playing, heading more towards jazz and rock and writing my own music was a way for me to kind of escape the terrors and the pressure of having to enter the musical Olympics.
How much do you think the recording industry contributed to that?
Well, it's a good question. I think, having at our disposal all of these amazing, remarkable recordings, sets a very, very high bar. And, while I think there have always been great, virtuosi of every age, and, back in the early days of recording, when everything was done live, you can really witness these incredible players who, put these performances down from beginning to end. And the discipline of that, and now the discipline, has a lot more to do with the editor, the editor's skills in the studio. But, it's tough. It's a very high bar, but I think the expectation now is that when you go to a concert, it's going to sound exactly like a recording. And that's true in the pop field as well as in classical.
How much do you think that the demand for perfection that can come from the recording industry creates an environment that can be very stressful for a lot of musicians?
One of the problems is not just the recording industry and these perfect recordings that set such a high bar for live performance, but the formality of live performance in the classical world. Now, there's plenty of performance anxiety in all kinds of performing besides classical styles. But I think anytime there's a performance situation that is very formalized, it makes it difficult. I find that what I try to do is to ask myself, how can I make this situation comfortable for me? How can I take a very formal concert situation and somehow disarm the audience, make it more casual, say something that brings it back to a one-to-one kind of relationship with the audience, so I don't feel like I'm standing on the stage of Carnegie Hall to this sort of nameless judgmental gallery, of pantheon of all the greats who have been on this stage are looking over my shoulder. There's, you can certainly psych yourself out and create, and it's very easy to do when the situation is inherently formal. And of course, the more important the situation is, the more difficult it is to relax. We all know in any situation, on stage or in life.
How much do your stresses around performance come from the outside or from the inside?
I think, to be honest, they come more from inside. Because I have experienced over many years of being a performer this strange phenomenon of being totally freaked out by a situation that I should have no reason to be nervous about, and to be completely at ease in a place where I should be terrified. So it's very weird. It seems to have a lot more to do with where I am in that moment, and it's. I've tried to figure out how can I control that. That's really been the key to this. You know, how can I take control of that situation? Because it seems to almost be dictated by like biorhythms or something. You know, things that are just out of my control. How much sleep I've had in the last month. You know, which is not completely out of my control, although, you know, for kids it often is. But you know, other things, just my general health, my psychological well-being, where I am in terms of my confidence level in my career seems to have a lot to do with these things. And of course, confidence is the key. To be able to walk on stage, and I don't think there's any performer who can really perform at their best without some form of confidence. And what I have noticed with that is that you can, a forced confidence, like if you have to sort of psych yourself into being confident, that usually has a certain amount of swagger and braggadocio about that. That's a little forced and a little arrogant and off-putting and egotistical, because it's really coming from a place of fear, coming from this egocentric place of how am I ranking compared to my peers? How am I being seen and judged by this audience? And it's coming from this place of fear. It's all working against a fear-based, trying to get back on the good foot. How can I, bolster myself for this confrontation with the audience. And when I feel myself getting into that cycle, I kind of recognize those symptoms. And I know how to deal with them physically. I have a way of, I'll do my breathing exercises, 5 in, hold for 5, 5 out, kind of thing, and do 5 of those, and that centers me and, gets me away from the fight or flight panic mode, which is you have to break that cycle. And then I remind myself that to be in that mode is to be acting out of fear, is to be acting, which is, okay to be fearful, but to remind myself that I'm letting my ego get the better of me. What I really want to do on stage is to not get the audience's approval or judgment, but to tell them a story, to take them someplace else. Your body has an incredible power to change your psychological place by controlling your breathing, by consciously relaxing your joints, your shoulders, your neck, your face, all of that. For me, I know that by keeping myself physically warm, when I get cold, I start to shiver, and this tension creeps into my body. If I can warm myself, it helps me relax physically. So those things, and it's amazing what happens when you can take a deep breath. Your whole outlook on life changes. There's nothing wrong with the fake it till you make it, because it's not faking anything. It's the exact opposite. It's the most real thing you can do. Somebody should come out with the alternative to that. Reel it till you, whatever. Seal it. But, what happens is what you're doing is you're going, okay, how can I really get in this moment? How can I really look at the audience without a tunnel vision of fear? How can I notice the beautiful colors of this room? Things that bring you out of yourself and into an awareness of the reality that you are now in. And to use that excitement of the exhilaration of getting in front of a lot of people and sharing your story, which there's plenty of room for disaster, and we all know. But, why focus on that when you can focus on, just this idea of, well, if something goofy happens, I'll make a joke about it and something will come out of my mouth. I'll roll with it. Stay loose. Just stay loose is the best, way to be, we all know. The performances and the performers that have affected me are the ones who, at the end of the performance, when you've talked about how great their voice was, how great the song was, or how blah, 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 it always comes down to how they've shared their humanity with me, how they've just opened themselves. I just happened to see Stevie Wonder the other night, which is, he's just one of my, heroes. And I didn't know what to think. He's 65. I've heard he's been singing great. I've heard little snippets, but I didn't want to be disappointed. And I was floored, besides everything else, just by the fact that he was as open to the audience as I've ever known a performer to be. And I remember, in fact, I was telling somebody about this, that there was this complete, ego was not even a part of it. It was about, he was talking about love. And before he even sat down and played a note, he had a little chat with the audience for about 10 minutes about how, he said, I just want to talk to everybody. We have to love each other. This is what's important, we got to do the love dance forever, people. And to start off a concert on that foot is completely, it's not about, do I have the confidence to perform? It's, what am I trying to say to you before I die? What do I need to tell you? What is, if there was something on my deathbed that I had to tell the people who I love, what would that be? It would be, is my hair okay? It's going to be something much more important than what do you think of me? So the performers who I love have instinctively been able to find that. So as a performer, I go, that's what I aspire to. And as a composer, as somebody who is a creative musician, and we were drawing that distinction between recreating music and the side of the brain that works on being perfect, and the creative musician and the side of the brain that works on experimenting and doesn't care about error. And for whom perfection has nothing to do with being right in the sense of being accurate, but has to do with finding that which is most important to you as a creative person. I used to wish, in fact, I've done this on a few occasions. I've told the audience, just as a sort of experiment in performance, what I do here is a lot of improvisation, and it's on the violin, and it's really hard. And in order for me to really do the best performance, I'm going to go for it. And I may miss a pedal here on my loop pedal, and the music may stop for a second, and it may be a disaster. But I'm going to go for it. So if it happens, sue me. And you know what? It just, they relaxed, I relaxed, and it was, and to create that kind of performance environment, I think is what they're after as an audience. They're, they would love to see me be flawless, because then, it's sort of, everybody loves a hero.
What's it like for you being a member of the audience compared to a performer on stage?
As an audience member, I feel more emotional. I feel more affected by it. I feel driven, more to tears. And as a performer, I've almost just been more in my studio, in my private space. If I can close my eyes on stage and get there, it's more when I've sort of forgotten about the audience more than, touched them, felt this connection, I guess.
You do a lot of improvising. Tell me a bit about what it's like to improvise.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, how the different processes that are going on in our brain. It's because you really are multitasking and doing two very different things. They did a study, I read somewhere, that they finally conclusively understood something that I've always, and most musicians I think have instinctively felt. They put some music in front of a bunch of piano players, and these were both classical and jazz piano players, but they gave them things to recreate, like read this music, play C major scale, play C major arpeggios, and monitoring what's going on in their brain, and then they asked them to improvise things, and improvising in their own style and whatever, just to make things up. And they discovered not only that different areas were lighting up, but that in order to be creative, the musicians had to actually suppress the part of their brain that was the part that had to recreate, and that was playing a C major scale properly. In other words, they had to stop trying to be proper. They had to, as whenever that, part of their consciousness that was censoring what they were doing was paying attention to, oh, is that right? Did you do that correctly? It would inhibit their creativity. So in order to be creative, they actually had to not let that voice come in. And now as a musician, especially as a violinist, the precision that you need in order to just play something, listenable is quite high. To play something in tune requires constant attention. You can't really play the violin without listening to it. There aren't buttons to push, or keys to press. You have to really listen. And you have to listen critically at the same time, and the listening that goes, is that sharp, is that flat, how, and immediately change it. And to have this system of ear to hand coordination. But it has to be so subliminal that you don't let that get in the way of creativity. And this is probably one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of improvising violinists, because it's hard to juggle these two things.
It's funny because improvisation was so much part of Mozart and Beethoven's world, and we seem to have lost that in the classical music world now.
While I do think that there's a very high standard of performance, even then, I think a lot of people tend to think that has creeped up, and I guess it probably has. I'm guessing, and of course it's pure conjecture, that there was a certain tolerance, an expectation of error and imperfection. And that, because I just don't think you have a creative environment without it. And now if you look at jazz, and listen to trumpet players, you'll hear Miles Davis crack notes all the time and leave them in intentionally, as if to say, I am not going for this kind of perfection, this idea of something being flawless, because that superficial flawlessness is an imperfection creatively. The kind of perfection that Miles was going after was the perfection of honesty, of authenticity. And that's what I tell myself before I go on stage, I tell myself that I can't make any mistakes, because as long as I'm being myself, and as long as my intention is good. You listen to blues singers, they're happy to crack a note, to break a note, because it shows how much you care, it shows how much your emotion is on that note, So I think you have to let people, you have to let them be themselves in order to let them tell the story. And that's the best cure for performance anxiety that I have. How to get there is tricky. So I have little notes in my violin case that I write to myself in moments of wisdom like this, and I'll say, little quirks like a Stevie Wonder quirk, or Miles Davis, I don't care what you think of me.
What do you do when things go wrong on stage?
The first thing I do is to remind myself to breathe. Usually, I start physically by saying, relax my hands and get into the rhythm. I know that if I get off kilter and if I'm not in the music somehow, and usually it's a very vague feeling of like, why am I not into this more? Why is this not as good as it was in rehearsal? Or, that kind of narrative going on in your brain behind the things, and which is a dangerous thing to entertain when you're on stage, but we all hear those voices, and usually I go, okay, because I'm not loose, so I start with that, with the reel, and bring myself in, and I know that if I can get my body into the rhythm, if I can free my body, my mind will follow. So, and that's usually the case. Once I start getting my groove back in some way, I go, okay, that's why it wasn't as good as rehearsal, because I'm scared on stage of what people think of me, or I'm tense, or, I'm just in a, scrutinized, the spotlight is on. Sometimes there are cameras projecting me on big screens, and, how would anybody feel? Understandably, I'm a little stiff in this situation, so relax. And usually that helps a good deal.
Now you're playing so many more contemporary compositions in the classical world. Do you feel that you're bringing your experience of jazz and rock into that?
I try, as much as possible. I think, being comfortable with improvisation is a huge help. Again, this has just been my mission in life, was to sort of update violin playing by incorporating rock sounds, just in the violin, in the vibrato, in the way I'm using the bow, articulation by using much less or no vibrato, things that sound more like jazz and more like rock. So bringing that attitude into the music, to me, relaxes me. It means to me that I'm not competing with every other classical violinist out there. I'm trying to, which was a big thing for me coming out of Juilliard, and had a lot to do, again, with sort of performance anxiety, but avoiding this competition aspect and the Olympics aspect of music that I was seeing in the conservatory. I decided, what, I'm not going to be that. I'm not going to be the 100th, Tchaikovsky violin concerto recording in the Schwann catalog. I just didn't, see the need for that. I'm going to be the guy who plays the violin like a guitar player. So that immediately kind of took me away from that competitive mindset and framework. So that, having that rock and jazz background is a source of power, confidence, and relaxation for me on stage. It's also very tied to my sense of authenticity. So it all works together for me to make me feel like I can walk on stage and have a voice which is mine, which I think may be the real key to all performance anxiety. To walk on stage and to feel that you can just be yourself, and that's good enough.
Tracy Silverman, thank you so much. It's been great to talk with you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah.